Motivation is a liar. It shows up when everything feels easy and disappears the moment things get hard. The people who build extraordinary lives are not the ones who feel inspired every day. They are the ones who act regardless of how they feel. This is the uncomfortable truth almost no one wants to hear. Motivation was never meant to carry you to your goals. Discipline was. And discipline, once it becomes strong enough, eventually transforms into something far more powerful than either. It becomes obsession. Not the unhealthy kind that destroys you, but the kind that makes stopping feel impossible. This is the real path from where you are now to where you actually want to be. Why motivation was never meant to last. Most people build their entire approach to self-improvement around a single flawed assumption. They believe that if they just find the right motivation, everything else will follow naturally. They search for inspirational videos, powerful quotes, and emotional stories, hoping that feeling will translate into action. And for a short period of time, it usually does. You feel energized, you make plans, you commit to changing everything. But within days, sometimes hours, that feeling fades, and with it, the action fades too. This happens because motivation is fundamentally an emotion, and emotions are, by nature, temporary. They rise and fall based on circumstances outside your control. Sleep, mood, stress, environment, even the weather can shift how motivated you feel on any given day. If your actions depend entirely on this unstable emotional state, your results will be equally unstable. You will work hard for a week, then disappear for 2. You will train intensely for a month, then abandon the gym for 6. This inconsistency is not a personal failure. It is the predictable outcome of building your life around a feeling that was never designed to be reliable. Robert Greene often explains that those who achieve mastery understand a principle most people never grasp. Emotion is a poor foundation for long-term achievement because emotion changes with circumstance, while true mastery requires consistency regardless of circumstance. The people who reach elite levels in their field are not the ones who felt motivated every single day. They are the ones who trained on the days they felt nothing at all. Their success was built during the unremarkable, uninspired hours that no one else was willing to endure. Think about what happens when someone waits for motivation before taking action. They wake up, check how they feel, and decide whether today is a productive day or not. This creates a dangerous dependency. Your progress becomes hostage to your emotional state. On days you feel strong, you move forward. On days you feel weak, you stay still. Over months and years, this pattern produces exactly what you would expect: inconsistent effort, inconsistent results, and a growing frustration with yourself for never quite becoming who you wanted to be. The people who separate themselves from this cycle understand something different. They do not ask, "Do I feel like doing this today?" They ask, "Is this what needs to be done today?" That subtle shift removes the emotional variable entirely. Action is no longer negotiable based on mood. It becomes a decision made once in advance and executed regardless of how the day happens to feel. This is the first quiet difference between people who talk about change and people who actually create it. There is also a psychological trap hidden inside the pursuit of motivation itself. The more you consume motivational content without corresponding action, the more your brain begins associating inspiration with the feeling of accomplishment rather than actual accomplishment. You watch a powerful speech, you feel moved, and your brain releases a small sense of satisfaction as if something has already been achieved. But nothing has changed. You have simply borrowed a temporary emotional high that requires no effort and produces no result. This is why some people can consume endless amounts of inspiring content and still remain exactly where they started. They have trained themselves to feel productive without ever becoming productive. This does not mean motivation is worthless. It can serve as a spark, an initial push that gets you moving in the right direction, but a spark cannot sustain a fire indefinitely. Something else has to take over once the initial excitement fades, something less dependent on emotion and more rooted in identity, structure, and commitment. That something is discipline, and understanding the difference between the two is where real transformation begins. Once you understand that motivation was never built to last, the next step is learning why discipline succeeds precisely where motivation fails, why discipline works. When feelings don't, discipline operates on a completely different principle than motivation. Where motivation asks how you feel, discipline asks what you decided. It removes the daily negotiation entirely because the decision was already made in advance, often long before the moment of resistance ever arrives. This is why disciplined people appear almost unnaturally consistent. They are not fighting a new internal battle every single day. They fought that battle once when they committed to the standard, and now they simply execute it. Robert Greene frequently emphasizes that those who master any craft understand the value of what he calls the apprenticeship phase, a period defined not by excitement but by repetition, patience, and unglamorous consistency. The people who eventually reach mastery are rarely the most naturally talented or the most emotionally inspired. They are the ones who showed up during the parts of the process that offered no immediate reward, no applause, and no visible progress. Discipline is what allows a person to continue working when the results are invisible and the motivation has long since disappeared. This is precisely why discipline feels difficult at first. It requires acting against your immediate impulses in favor of a long-term outcome your emotions cannot yet see. Every time you choose to train instead of rest, work instead of scroll, or practice instead of procrastinate, you are overriding a short-term feeling for the sake of a future you have not yet experienced. This override is uncomfortable precisely because human beings are wired to prioritize immediate comfort over delayed reward. Discipline is the skill of ignoring that wiring on purpose. Consider two people pursuing the same goal. The first relies entirely on motivation. They train hard when they feel inspired, then stop the moment that feeling fades. Their effort resembles a series of sprints followed by long periods of stillness. The second person relies on discipline. They train on schedule regardless of mood, treating the commitment as non-negotiable, the same way they would treat brushing their teeth or showing up to a job they cannot afford to lose. Over a year, the difference between these two people becomes undeniable, not because one is more talented, but because one built a system that does not depend on how they feel, while the other never did. There is a hidden psychological benefit to discipline that most people overlook entirely. Every time you follow through on a commitment despite not feeling like it, you send yourself a powerful message. You learn that your word to yourself actually means something. This might sound simple, but it is one of the most underrated forms of self-respect that exists. Most people break promises to themselves constantly. They say they will wake up early and don't. They say they will start Monday and don't. Each broken promise, even the small ones, quietly teaches your own mind that your commitments are optional. Over time, this erodes your self-trust in ways that are difficult to reverse. Discipline reverses this pattern entirely. Every kept promise, no matter how small, reinforces the belief that you are someone who follows through. This creates a compounding effect. The more evidence you gather that you keep your word, the easier it becomes to trust yourself with bigger commitments. Confidence, in this sense, is not something you manufacture through positive thinking. It is something you build through repeated proof, gathered one disciplined action at a time. This is also why discipline tends to produce calm rather than chaos. A disciplined life has structure. You know what you are doing today because you decided it in advance. There is no daily debate, no internal negotiation, no wasted mental energy deciding whether today is worth the effort. This structure creates a strange kind of freedom because the decision has already been made. Your mind is free to focus entirely on execution rather than deliberation. However, discipline alone, while powerful, can sometimes feel like a grind. It requires constant willpower, a force that can become depleted over time if it is the only tool being used. This is why discipline, when sustained long enough and aimed at something meaningful enough, often transforms into something even more powerful, something that no longer requires willpower at all because the action itself becomes the identity. That transformation is obsession, and understanding how it develops separates those who eventually plateau from those who become unstoppable. Once you understand why discipline succeeds where motivation fails, the next step is learning how disciplined action, sustained long enough, evolves into something that no longer feels like effort at all. How discipline transforms into obsession there is a specific moment in the journey of mastery that most people never reach. Because most people quit long before discipline has the chance to evolve into something greater. This moment occurs when consistent action stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like identity. You no longer train because you decided to. You train because that is simply who you are. This shift marks the beginning of obsession, and it is the single most powerful force behind extraordinary achievement. Obsession, in this context, is not the destructive, all-consuming compulsion often portrayed in stories of burnout or addiction. It is something far more constructive. It is the state in which your goal has become so deeply integrated into your identity that pursuing it no longer requires the willpower discipline once demanded. Robert Greene often describes this as the point where an individual's work becomes an extension of who they are rather than something they do. At this stage, resistance decreases dramatically. Not because the work becomes easier, but because the internal conflict between what you want to do and what you feel like doing disappears entirely. Think about the difference between someone who disciplines themselves to write for 1 hour every day and someone who has become obsessed with mastering their craft as a writer. The disciplined person checks the clock, tracks their progress, and feels a quiet satisfaction when the hour is complete. The obsessed person loses track of time entirely. They think about their work in the shower, during conversations, while falling asleep. Their mind returns to the craft, not because they forced it to, but because it has become the lens through which they interpret the world around them. This is not exhaustion. It is total absorption, and it produces a level of output that discipline alone rarely achieves. This transition from discipline to obsession does not happen randomly. It develops through a specific process. First, discipline creates consistency. Consistency, sustained over time, produces small but visible improvements. Those improvements generate genuine interest because the brain naturally becomes more engaged with something it is visibly getting better at. That interest deepens into curiosity, curiosity into fascination, and fascination, if fed long enough through continued action, eventually becomes obsession. This is why so many masters of their craft describe a moment where the work stopped feeling like labor and started feeling like play, despite the immense skill and effort involved. There is a crucial distinction that must be understood here. Obsession without discipline is dangerous. It can lead to burnout, imbalance, and unsustainable intensity that collapses under its own weight. But obsession built on a foundation of discipline is different entirely. It is structured, sustainable, and directed. The discipline provides the framework, the schedule, the boundaries. The obsession provides the fuel, the depth, and the relentless drive that makes exceptional results possible. Neither one alone is enough. Discipline without obsession often produces competence. Obsession without discipline often produces chaos. Together, they produce mastery. Robert Greene frequently points to history's most accomplished individuals as evidence of this principle. Nearly all of them describe a period of intense, almost singular focus on their craft, a period where nothing else seemed to matter as much. This intensity was not manufactured through motivation. It emerged naturally after years of disciplined practice, created a depth of understanding that most people never reach because most people quit long before the obsession has a chance to form. Depth creates fascination, fascination creates obsession, and obsession, properly channeled, creates results that appear almost impossible to those observing from the outside. There is another important element to understand about this transformation. Obsession changes your relationship with difficulty itself. For someone relying purely on motivation, difficulty is a signal to stop because the feeling of struggle contradicts the emotional high they were chasing. For someone relying on discipline, difficulty is something to be endured through willpower. But for someone who has developed genuine obsession, difficulty becomes interesting. It becomes a puzzle to solve rather than an obstacle to escape. This reframing is what allows obsessed individuals to continue pushing forward in situations that would cause others to quit entirely. This does not mean the process is always comfortable or that obsession removes all resistance. Even deeply obsessed individuals experience days of frustration, plateaus, and doubt. The difference is that these moments no longer threaten the entire pursuit. They become temporary friction within a much larger, unshakable commitment rather than reasons to abandon the goal altogether. The identity has shifted from someone trying to achieve something to someone who simply is that thing. And identities are far more resistant to temporary setbacks than temporary goals ever are. Once you understand how discipline evolves into obsession, the next step is learning how to protect that obsession from becoming destructive, so that it fuels your growth instead of consuming your life. How to keep obsession from consuming you. Obsession, once developed, carries a hidden danger that must be addressed directly. The same intensity that produces extraordinary results can, if left unchecked, destroy the very foundation that made those results possible in the first place. This is why the healthiest, most sustainable form of obsession is never separated from structure. Without boundaries, obsession stops serving your life and starts consuming it, and there is a critical difference between the two. Robert Greene often warns that even the most brilliant minds throughout history occasionally fell victim to their own intensity, losing sight of balance, relationships, and health in pursuit of their singular goal. Their obsession, when it lacked structure, sometimes produced burnout severe enough to derail years of progress. This is an important lesson. Obsession is not inherently good or bad. It is a force, and like any powerful force, its value depends entirely on how it is directed and contained. The key difference between destructive obsession and constructive obsession lies in one specific factor: sustainability. Destructive obsession sacrifices the future for the present. It ignores sleep, health, and relationships in favor of relentless output, believing that intensity today justifies neglect in every other area of life. This approach might produce impressive short-term results, but it inevitably collapses because the human body and mind cannot sustain extreme output indefinitely without proper recovery. Constructive obsession, by contrast, understands that longevity multiplies results far more than short bursts of unsustainable intensity ever could. This is why the most successful individuals, despite their intense focus, still maintain certain non-negotiable boundaries. They protect their sleep, not because they lack ambition, but because they understand that a depleted mind produces inferior work. They maintain key relationships, not out of obligation, but because isolation eventually undermines the very stability that allows obsession to remain productive rather than destructive. They build recovery into their schedule with the same seriousness they build their work, understanding that rest is not the opposite of progress. It is a requirement for it. There is a specific mindset shift that separates those who use obsession as fuel from those who are consumed by it. It is the difference between obsession serving a larger purpose and obsession becoming the entire identity with no purpose beyond itself. When your intense focus is connected to something meaningful, a vision for your future, a standard you refuse to compromise, a version of yourself you are committed to becoming, that obsession remains grounded. But when the obsession becomes disconnected from any larger meaning and exists purely as compulsive behavior, it begins consuming everything around it without producing anything of lasting value. This is why reflection becomes essential once obsession takes hold. Successful individuals regularly ask themselves whether their intensity is still serving their larger goals or whether it has quietly become something they can no longer control. This kind of self-awareness prevents obsession from becoming blind. It allows a person to remain fully committed to their craft while still recognizing when adjustment, rest, or recalibration is necessary. Obsession without self-awareness eventually burns out. Obsession paired with self-awareness becomes sustainable for decades. Another important safeguard involves maintaining perspective outside of the singular pursuit. Even the most focused individuals benefit from moments that remind them of the wider world, relationships that have nothing to do with their goal, activities that provide genuine rest rather than distraction disguised as rest, and reminders that their worth as a person does not depend entirely on their achievement. Without this perspective, obsession can quietly become identity fusion so complete that any setback in the pursuit feels like a threat to existence itself. That level of fusion is fragile, and fragile obsession collapses under pressure far more easily than obsession that remains anchored to a broader sense of self. The individuals who sustain extraordinary output over long periods of time are rarely the ones burning at maximum intensity every single day. They are the ones who understand rhythm, periods of intense focus followed by periods of intentional recovery, repeated consistently over years rather than months. This rhythm is what allows obsession to remain a renewable resource rather than something that inevitably exhausts itself. Discipline provides the structure for this rhythm. Without it, even the most powerful obsession eventually collapses under its own weight. Once you understand how to protect your obsession from consuming you, the final step is learning how to combine motivation, discipline, and obsession into a single unstoppable system that carries you forward long after the initial excitement has faded. Building the system that never quits everything explored so far leads to one final understanding. Motivation, discipline, and obsession are not competing forces. They are stages in a single process, each one serving a different purpose at a different point in the journey. Motivation ignites the beginning. Discipline carries you through the middle, the long, unremarkable stretch where most people quit because the excitement has faded and the results have not yet arrived. Obsession, once discipline has done its work, becomes the force that makes stopping feel impossible because the pursuit has become inseparable from who you are. Most people fail not because they lack potential, but because they misunderstand which force is required at which stage. They wait for motivation to return instead of relying on discipline to carry them forward. They quit during the difficult middle phase, unaware that this exact discomfort is what eventually produces the depth necessary for obsession to develop. They never give discipline enough time to transform into something greater because they abandon the process the moment it stops feeling exciting, which is precisely the moment it needed to be sustained the most. Robert Greene often reminds us that mastery is never achieved through inspiration alone. It is achieved through those willing to endure the unglamorous, invisible portion of the process that no one applauds and few people witness. This is the portion where motivation has long since disappeared and where discipline becomes the only thing standing between a person and their goal. Those who survive this stage are rewarded with something motivation could never provide, a depth of skill and understanding that eventually transforms effort into fascination, and fascination into obsession. The system that never quits is built in a specific order. It begins with a decision made in advance, independent of daily emotion. It continues through consistent action, repeated even on days when nothing about the process feels rewarding. It develops through patience, allowing enough time for small improvements to accumulate into visible skill. And it culminates in a shift of identity, where the pursuit stops being something you do and becomes something you are. At that point, obsession takes over, not as a destructive compulsion, but as a sustainable, structured intensity that continues carrying you forward long after willpower alone would have run out. This is the difference between those who talk about transformation and those who actually achieve it. It was never about waiting for the right feeling. It was about building a system strong enough that feelings no longer had the power to derail it. Motivation gets you started. Discipline keeps you going. Obsession makes you unstoppable. And once all three work together, driven by structure rather than chaos, there is very little that can stand in the way of what you are capable of becoming.